Hi everyone, I'm back on here making sketchbook flip-throughs. Today we're going to be looking at what, to me, is the most important project I've undertaken so far, my Norwalk in Ink series. As we move through these first few pages, I'd like to first talk a bit about how this sketchbook came to be. Over the summer of 2020, when we were all looking for excuses to get out of the house during lockdown, I started to try my luck at urban sketching in my hometown of Norwalk. These first few drawings were done without any future plan or knowledge of how to urban sketch, and so, as I'm sure you'll notice, there's a lot of inconsistency and sometimes poor compositional choices. However, as I began to do these on-site drawings more often, I really took a liking to this form of art making, while at the same time beginning to dream about filling the whole book with urban sketches from Norwalk. It wasn't until my first semester of college, which was entirely remote, that I was able to fall into a routine of doing 3 of these sketches a week. And with that came an improvement in the drawing composition and consistency. That is not to say that I was suddenly churning out masterpieces with every new outing. In fact, there are still countless drawings in this book that I am slightly embarrassed to show to the public. However, as cheesy as it sounds, the worst drawings were the best lessons, as they taught me what not to do in the future, and what kind of compositions did not translate to pen and ink. For example, in this drawing I filled in the street with a dark gray to match the actual diffused color of the asphalt, without realizing that it took away from the much more interesting cast shadow shapes on Washington Street. With this next drawing, which depicts a location I came back to 3 times in this book, I'd like to point out an important disclaimer about the project. I did not pick my subjects without bias. I grew up in this city, and therefore I have my own attachments to certain neighborhoods or buildings. Every resident of Norwalk, if given this task, would likely do the same. There is no objective census as to what places define Norwalk as a whole, only our individual experiences. You'll notice throughout this flip-through that certain areas or locations are featured much more heavily than others, which is not to disparage the beauty of any one place, but rather to stay true to the places that make me love this city. At this point in the book, I had committed to making it into its own project, due to certain drawings, like this one, showing significant improvement from the sketches I began with. At this time, I also began to play around with different kinds of compositions, as well as new kinds of subjects. Rather than designing my drawings to focus on a singular building, I became more interested in streetscapes and collectives of buildings, to empathize how these scenes fit into the broader context of Norwalk. On that note, despite the aforementioned bias, at this point, I had also thought more holistically about where I would draw next, almost as if planning a tour of the city for a first-time visitor. Although Norwalk residents will instantly recognize that the majority of these drawings are from Sono, I made a conscious effort to make stops at other neighborhoods of the city. However, areas like Cranberry and Silvermine are almost entirely residential, so it quickly became difficult for me to find subjects there, which we'll see later on in the book. Speaking of first-time visitors, if you're watching and have never been to Norwalk before, a lot of the remainder of the video will be a narration of each drawing. I'm aware that most of the names and places won't mean much to you, but hopefully the drawing will say enough about the place to suffice. For my Norwalk residents watching, what up? If any of these drawings depict a location you care for or are fond of, I'm glad we share a mutual affinity for the spot. In terms of materials, I used an 8 by 5.5 inch spread sketchbook from Jerry's Autorama in Norwalk. I drew the lines with Micron pens and added shadows and value with Faber-Castell ink markers. With that, I'll end my very long introduction and just start talking about the drawings themselves. This drawing is looking at the Norwalk Aquarium in downtown Sono from the opposite side of the river, which I got to via the River Esplanade walk. Cranberry Market is one of the few public locations in the Cranberry neighborhood, so I felt the need to do some sketching there. Drawing in the rain is always an issue, especially when painting with permanent soluble media like ink. This spot is right on West Ave by Waypoint. This little neighborhood is in between downtown Sono and the Ice House, on the way to Village Creek. This drawing was a very memorable experience. I wanted to fill up the whole spread, but physically could not as it was almost 0 Fahrenheit that day, and my fingers had stopped responding. I think this inconvenience actually improved the drawing with forced simplicity. This is the only drawing I did in Silvermine, as this little market is one of the only commercial buildings in the neighborhood. This drawing was done in Broad River Park in West Norwalk. I think the building here is a retirement home. I've always loved the massive Christmas tree that Stu Leonard's puts up around the holidays, so I had to include it here. The next two drawings were done sitting at the same bus stop, but facing two different directions. Both times I was engaged in deep conversation with residents waiting for the bus, which, although a bit distracting, was wildly entertaining. I felt that at some point I had to do an obligatory drawing of City Hall in East Norwalk, also done during the holidays. I love the little commercial streets besides the East Norwalk train station, particularly Station House and its surrounding stores. I drew this while sitting on the stone wall of the cemetery that the rest of East Norwalk seems to orbit around. This next drawing is just a little ways up the street, by a strip of shops on the way back to Sono. Oddly enough, I forgot past mistakes in this drawing and colored in the asphalt with dark gray in this one, although it turned out looking better than previous failures. It was pouring this day. I'm pretty sure I put the hatchback of my car up and drew sitting underneath it. I parked in the Sono movie theater lot. We got a good amount of snow of the winter of 2021, and I remember liking how much it changed the look of the streetscapes I was getting used to drawing. West Cedar Grocery is much closer to home, and I was lucky enough to draw this collection of stores when there was still plenty of snow to add contrast to the scene. I began this drawing skeptical of its composition, as there was a gaping hole in the center of the image. However, I was pleasantly surprised by the result, perhaps thanks to the 18-wheeler dead center. There's a Catholic church at the top of Cliff Street with a beautiful and unique architectural style, which I wish I could have given more justice with this drawing, perhaps next time. Staying on Cliff Street, I love how the neighborhood moves with the immensely steep hill as you look down toward the train track. Here is one of the few examples in this book of buildings that no longer exist anymore. Rest in peace, Garden Cinemas, a hidden gem by the river. At some point, I had to do a view of entering Sono, so I remember being on a very tight schedule doing this sketch. This was one of the first drawings where I focused on boats in the scene. They are very easy to mess up geometrically, so I had to be extra careful with my perspective here at the East Norwalk Boating Club. This drawing was long overdue. The Sono train station is a crucial part of the city, and to capture it from the best view available to me, I drew this while sitting on top of my car. This is a drawing that suffers from what I call steeple syndrome. The smokestack at the Cross Street Saloon is so tall that I had to squeeze the whole composition vertically for it to fit into the frame. Although I said before that I try to avoid just drawing a single building, the South Norwalk Public Library is so gorgeous that it deserves its own spread. I'm not sure what compelled me to draw LaJoy's auto shop on Meadow Street. I remember really liking that forklift in the bottom right. Oyster boats here. Edgewater Park is a tiny little patch of green tucked behind Mr. Frosty's and gives an incredible view of the harbor and Copp's Island oysters. Here's another one close to home. Norwalk Hospital has got a variety of entrances, and I like how close this one is to the shops and vendors right up the hill on Stephen Street. This was my favorite drawing in the book after finishing it, which depicts a little thrift store in which was once an old warehouse, a great example of Sono's adaptive reuse. Although I generally avoided Route 1 due to it being 80% parking lot, I had to sneak in a drawing of Zach's Barbershop and Bossy Deli, both great spots right by where I live. As a child, I was absolutely fascinated by the little house that hung off of the Stroffolino drawbridge. I think I was intrigued by its unique location, as well as the way it cantilevers over the water below. This drawing is one of the most educational experiences I had while working on the project. I remember sitting down beside the interstate and thinking, this is a horribly uninteresting view. As of now, it's one of my favorite sketches in the book due to its simplicity and looseness. I ventured back to Cranberry for this one to draw the beautiful Greek Orthodox church on the way to Cranberry Park. This sketch was done in a bit of a shady location, in a rock bed below 95 behind the mall. I was glad no one spotted me while drawing. I would have looked very suspicious. The block at Waypoint is a beautiful new courtyard complex with restaurants and shops all around its base. Its neighborhood is being built up rapidly, and a little too rapidly if you ask me, which I'll talk about later. There are older historic apartment buildings behind Wall Street that I absolutely adore, especially in evening light like when this drawing was done. Another simple drawing here. The shops alongside Mochica are all one-storied, so this drawing ended up looking like a horizontal bar of detail, with blank paper above and below. This drawing of Jerry's upholstery was also done in the freezing cold. It was my first drawing of a very productive winter break between semesters. Back to my neighborhood strip, I see a lot of nurses and hospital staff go in and out of these shops as the hospital back entrance is literally right behind where I was sitting. I was incredibly lucky to find such a great view of the Norwalk River, with the beautiful Wall Street arch bridge above its waters. It felt odd to draw a large boat and a fire escape in the same scene. Speaking of the river, here's a wide view of downtown Sono from one of my favorite public parks in the city, Oyster Shell. To my fellow residents, you'll notice that this drawing was done before the IMAX theater by the railroad bridge was demolished. It was a cold and misty day while I drew this one at Cross Street, so I tried to keep my scenes simple and light-colored. There's a mural on the garage door of the Maritime Aquarium's front facade. I'm not sure if it was commissioned or graffitied on by a local street artist. Either way, it definitely enhances the scene. This Baptist church right beside my elementary school in downtown Sono has a golden onion dome atop its steeple, which I remember loving as a child. We got some snow the winter of 2022 as well, so I drew in Cranberry Park where it lay mostly untouched and perfect. My drawing of Riverview Plaza was inhibited by both the cold and by the many people waiting at the bus stop that I was sitting at, although the latter was the result of my mistake to draw there. I sat on a milk crate and drew Post Road Diner, one of my favorite places for milkshakes, in almost sub-zero temperatures. I got a lot of weird looks from people leaving the diner. It was raining during this drawing session, so I had to be quick. This sketch was done behind O'Neill's Irish Pub in Sono. I made sure to get a drawing of all three of the major Norwalk River bridges into this book, the interstate being the least aesthetic of the three. However, the Esplanade walkway where I sat for this was beautiful in the springtime. The Ironworks Courtyard is a cool little collective of shops and apartment complexes right off of Washington Street in downtown Sono. I had a blast drawing dappled shadows onto the van on the bottom right. I love this parking garage behind Washington Street, particularly due to the vine-infested old building beside it. In retrospect, however, I definitely shouldn't have shaded the vines so heavily. Here's yet another drawing of the commercial strip right in my neighborhood, but this time from the employee entrance behind the shop fronts. I'm not sure how it happened, but I absolutely adore that one bit that juts out above the cars with diagonal supports. Here lies another staple of Norwalk that will soon be no more. The Norwalk River Swing Bridge is one of the oldest structures in the city and is being replaced next year with a vertical lift bridge. I did my best to capture the beautiful lighting effects the structure creates while it remains with us. Sono is chock full of old, run-down brick buildings that are clearly being held together by their occupants, which I find to be incredibly endearing. I'm not sure what they're building here beside this East Norwalk office building, but I picked the scene as an excuse to draw the almost horizontal cherry picker lift. Although I wish I could have included the giant silver letters to complete the Sono sign on the bottom right, this drawing acts almost as a poster child for this project, as this intersection is practically the very center of Norwalk. Finding a spot to draw the towering smokestack of the abandoned Manresa power plant took some serious physical effort, including hopping fences and climbing numerous jetties. However, it was worth it to see the power plant up close, as since I was a kid, I'd only ever looked at it from across the harbor. I love some of the little shops on Wall Street, particularly the little spirituality shop in the bottom right, with the vines covering its side. I drew the riverside portion of Divine Bros as another excuse to sketch machinery, as well as the massive barge that the cranes reside upon. Whoever designed the bus shelters at the Norwalk Wheels bus station needs a raise, because there are some seriously cool structures that were super fun to draw. The Latin grocery store at Wall Street and West Ave is covered in murals painted by local artists, an incredible bit of the spot that I was not able to include in this drawing. My apologies. At this point in the project, I had begun to populate my sketches with scale figures, which, in retrospect, greatly improved the sense of life and scale in each drawing. I only wish I'd started drawing people into more of my earlier sketches. When looking for a spot to draw, sometimes inspiration hits in the most mundane locations. Here's exit 15 off of 95, along with a bit of the West Ave Heritage Wall. Another example of a mundane spot that is now one of my favorite drawings in this book, this McMahon Ford car dealership, when illuminated with early evening light, became a wonderful subject to draw. If I had to add color to any of my drawings, it would undoubtedly be this one. Spring Hill Liquors is a bright pink building, and such a statement almost justified a break in my art style. Every time I drive through the Norwalk Cove Marina, I see tradesmen hard at work below the boat stands of various vessels, all of which are challenging and yet wildly entertaining to draw. Yet another example of a built part of Norwalk that features zero buildings. Sometimes a vehicle would pull up right in front of a scene I was drawing. In some cases, I remove it from the scene if it's too obstructive, but in this case, I decided to keep the minivan in front of Blueberry Hill Antiques, as it added to the drawing. This bridge above the railroad tracks is a common waiting spot for day workers around town. Groups of them kept giving me suspicious looks as I sat on my milk crate, staring at the bridge. I don't blame them. This is one of the only drawings in the book that features residential buildings only. If anyone living in Village Creek is watching this, I'm sorry that I drew you in your neighbors' houses without permission. I drew Exxon gas station on Christmas Eve day while it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I quite literally had to defrost my fingers on the steering wheel before I left the spot. It is a shame that I did not include more of Calf Pasture Beach in this sketchbook, as it is one of the most popular public parks in Norwalk. The beach's pier stretches far out into the harbor and gives you a great view of the Norwalk Islands. The oyster fishermen were hard at work while I drew the Cops Oysters docks, and I had to stop drawing a couple times to admire how well these guys did their job. The YMCA, after having been abandoned for over 8 years, was demolished last year. I was lucky enough to sneak in this drawing right before it went. I always loved drawing vines slowly encasing old buildings. I had to move twice during this sketch, as construction workers were busy on making a new apartment complex besides the water. It's here I'm going to stop narrating each drawing for the remainder of the flip through, as, while reflecting on this project, I feel that it is time to discuss what all of this means. At the moment, Norwalk is changing drastically, and it's not just because my friends and I are growing up and moving out. I work at a restaurant here, and recently countless customers tell me about how COVID pushed people out of New York City and sent them to cities like Norwalk. The subjects of numerous drawings in this book have already been torn down and are being rapidly replaced by apartment complexes, which all look the same. At the same time, property values across the entire town are skyrocketing, and paying rent is becoming more and more impossible for so many families in our city. In other words, Norwalk is going through a period of textbook definition gentrification. The issue is, I'm not sure that there is anything to be done about it at this point. It seems silly to stop the population increase of Norwalk. In fact, I'm sure that for a lot of people, it is a good thing. However, it is times like these where I think it is most crucial for Norwalkers to reflect on the places that have shaped who we are today. Not much about Norwalk is particularly remarkable, but I, along with so many others, have lived here almost my whole life, and therefore have a great sense of pride and deep respect for the people and places of this harbor town. I think that everyone who has grown up in one location should consider that fact, and understand that while passers-by might not think anything of it, our hometowns are unique and beautiful to a degree that cannot be put into words. With that, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed my drawings and narration. Comment or subscribe if you'd like.